Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the BRLSI. I'm Tony Symes, and normally I introduce lectures for the Herschel Astronomy Society, but now I'm standing in for Paul Jackson, whose subject is heritage, and tonight's talk is Queer Georgians, and the lecturer is Dr. Tim Moore. The BRLSI is proud to be taking part in the Queer Bath Festival, and there are a lot of events on over the month, which can be seen on the website queerbath.co.uk. At the BRLSI, we have a Thriving Heritage series, and the next event in that series will be on Wednesday, the 2nd of July. It's called Sham Castle, Fact and Fiction by Mike Macklin. Back to tonight, and Dr. Tim Moore is a lecturer at the University of Oxford and a curator at the National Trust. His work focuses on the literature and culture of the 18th and 19th centuries, and his research specialism is on inclusive histories, especially queer histories and global or colonial histories. He's currently the Inclusive Histories Curator at Bath Assembly Rooms, a role dedicated to uncovering hidden and underrepresented aspects of Bath's history. Tim is also a renowned Jane Austen scholar and is a guest curator at the Jane Austen House, Chawton. Over to Tim.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to see you all, so thank you for making time to come today. Can you hear me at the back? Give me a quick wave. Perfect, great. So just a quick visual description if that's helpful for anyone in the room or online. So I'm a short, brown-skinned guy in my early 30s. I've got short, curly black hair. I'm wearing a tight white polo shirt today. It is Pride. So thank you for celebrating the beginning of Pride Month by coming to a talk on queer Georgians. I am obsessed with the Georgians and I'm very queer, so I think I'm pretty good authority on the subject today. I'm going to talk to you for about 45 minutes and then I'll leave time for questions. As Tony said, I'm the Inclusive Histories Curator at Bath Assembly Rooms. So that's a really wonderful job. Part of the thing that I love about it is I think Bath is often associated, especially if you watch the period dramas, with the kind of aristocratic elite. My job as Inclusive Histories Curator at the Bath Assembly Rooms is to research the undertold stories or the underrepresented stories to do with Bath and the Assembly Rooms. So that involves the ordinary working residents of the city. It involves the people of colour who were working in the city, the people who had disabilities working in the city. It meant people who had connections to global connections or colonial connections, and of course, people who had queer aspects to their life. And I am going to think a little bit more about that word queer and what that means and why we can use that term queer in the way that we do, but I'm kind of aware that that term is a contested one, so we'll get into that in a little bit. I just wanted to say that some of the themes that we're talking about today are of a sensitive nature. We are talking about a very different time to our own, so I will be using some of the language of that time. I will be talking about the attitudes of that time, which are very different to our own, and that does involve some themes of, for example, homophobia. There's one point at which I'll be talking about abuse, so I'm just kind of putting that out there at the beginning, just so you're aware that those are some of the nature of the topics we're talking about. But that said, this is a very celebratory talk, my kind of main takeaway that I'd love you to take away from this room at the end of the talk is that history is always more diverse than you think it is. And there are always more people like you than you might think there would be in history. History is so skewed towards the kind of big names and the royals and the kind of aristocratic elite, but really there's space for everyone in history, and that's the kind of territory which I'd like to spend the most time with today. And my final preamble point, I guess, is that the tone of today's lecture I want to keep very friendly and informal. I don't want to deliver a very kind of lofty academic talk when the actual topics that we're talking about are very sensitive, and we're talking about real people's lives and the things that really matter to them, the things that grappled with and the things that they found really difficult. So I want to keep it very friendly and light. I want to kind of introduce a real tone of humanity into the way that I deliver this talk. So I hope you'll indulge me being a bit more informal and a bit more maybe light than my normal kind of tone might be. Let's dive in, shall we? So I have three, I guess, main parts to the talk today. I want to spend a little bit of time in introduction and thinking about the context. I'll spend just a minute thinking about that term queer, which is such a complex word. I will be talking about the queer Georgians. I do believe there were queer Georgians, so I'll spend some time justifying that claim and elaborating on what I mean by that, and just giving a little bit of a window into who they were and what their lives were like. But really, I think we're all here for Bath as a queer scene. I do think that Bath had a very thriving queer subculture in the Georgian era. So for most of the talk, I'll be dwelling in the details of the real people who were living here, who were engaging in what we might consider queer or non-conforming behaviour. So those are the three main things that I'll be talking about today. Let's jump in straight away to the word queer. It's a word that we're using very differently nowadays to the way that it has been used historically. It first entered kind of British use in the 16th century, and that meant something that was strange or odd. And really importantly, it wasn't normally a negative term. I would liken it a little bit to the way we'd use the term unusual. Unusual it connotes something that it's different, but you wouldn't normally use the term unusual in a necessarily negative way. So it began its kind of journey in the English language as a very kind of neutral term. By the end of the by the early 20th century, it had kind of begun to be used in reference to homosexual behaviour, specifically male behaviour at the time. And by that point, it had lost its neutrality. It had become a kind of slightly stigmatising tone, which by the middle of the 20th century kind of really gave way to specifically a kind of very aggressive homophobic slur. And a lot of people kind of still remember kind of the way that this term was weaponized and mobilized against the gay and the queer community. So at that point, this word was really kind of used in a violent way as a weapon. It was reclaimed in the 80s and 90s by activists. So you might recognize that term, the kind of tone, the phrase, we're here, we're queer, and we're not going away. So that was a kind of deliberate reclamation, specifically kind of used in the kind of AIDS crisis to kind of recognize the kind of unique perspective that the queer community bring to the world. So this is the first time it's kind of trying to be it's taken back as a tool for power. And now, that thanks to the kind of work put in by those activists, the term queer, certainly in my generation, is seen as a very positive term. I'm very proud to identify as queer. And especially since the 90s and with the rise of queer theory, which is kind of used firstly in a kind of academic sense to kind of use, to think about what queer really means and what we can kind of learn from different perspectives of gender identity. So the word queer that I'm using today in the talk kind of really refers to this kind of umbrella identity that kind of came with the rise of queer theory. And it's useful as a term because it means it denotes any non-heteronormative behavior, but doesn't need any other label. So the term, for example, LGBTQ, that has specific categories within it. You can identify as gay or lesbian, but not really, well, not standardly both. Whereas the term queer is helpful because it's umbrella. It means you don't have to define yourself as, for example, bi or trans. You can just use the umbrella term queer and not kind of have to worry about putting yourself into a specific box other than that kind of umbrella term. So that's why I feel confident using the word queer and using it back in terms of history. It's an umbrella term. It's not using kind of very specific kind of semantic connotations. It means that we can look back at any non-conforming behavior or non-heteronormative behavior and think of it in terms of the context of being queer. There's one more kind of preamble that I want to jump into as an introduction. I'm going to be using a generalization again and again over the evening, and I'm going to talk about the uniqueness of Bath's social scene in the Georgian era. The reality was that Bath was a completely unique city. The social scene of Bath followed a completely different path to the social scene followed everywhere else in the country. It really marched to the beat of its own drum. So I'm going to talk about that again and again. I just want to kind of set out the groundwork for why I'm going to talk about that. So, and in particular, the Bath assemblies were known to be really one of the most inclusive spaces in the country. So an assembly, and remember I'm a curator for the assembly room, so it's kind of almost contractual that I have to give a little plug. to the assembly rooms. The assembly rooms were a completely unique social space in that when they opened in 1771, they were the first social space in the country where anyone could attend venues. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone. I mean a royal all the way down to a servant. So at the Bath Assembly Balls, what was known as the upper rooms or the new rooms at the time, because there were also some lower rooms at the time, but what we'd now think of as the Bath Assembly Rooms, they were the country's venue, the kind of most fashionable venue, but anyone could go. You didn't need to know the right people, you didn't need to have the right title, you didn't need to have enough money. Tickets were kept deliberately really cheap so that anyone could come, and everyone did come. So from servants, hairdressers, shopkeepers, all the way up to earls and royals. And that's really unique. There was only one place in the country that could happen, and that was right here. You can see just some quotes from through time talking about what it was like to be in Bath or at a Bath Assembly at the time. You can see that John Wood the Elder, who's really the brainchild of the Bath Assembly Rooms, he talks about rank being laid aside and all degrees of people uniting in society with one another. The New Bath Guide kind of gushes about the assembly rooms that everyone mixes there equally. Everyone, when the bell rings for tea, everyone goes and sits on the same benches and has the same food. The earls don't get different food to the servants and the hairdressers. Everyone can eat the same thing. It's a very equitable experience. Ladies could decline partners, which was a very radical practice and couldn't only, the kind of codes and etiquette of the time. And I love this poem by Christopher Anstey. It describes an election ball or kind of a special kind of political ball put on for a kind of political purpose. But you can see the list of guest attendees at a typical Bath ball. You can see that there were dukes and marquises and earls, but what drapers, what barbers, as well as peers, what marquises, earls, what knights of the shears. I love that term, knights of the shears, because it's kind of making a play on kind of being knighted, being aristocratic, being a sir. Actually, the kind of knights that were most common at the Bath Assembly Rooms were barbers and gardeners, knights of the shears. You can see that nymphs of the brooms, servants, and mop-sceptred queens. Queens came, real queens. Queen Charlotte came to the Assembly Rooms, but queens of the mop and the broom could come too. So this is a completely unique, radical social space. I'm sure you can see why I'm raising this now, and as a kind of preamble to a talk on queer Georgians, if I'm kind of asserting that Bath's social scene is already uniquely radical and uniquely liberal, uniquely tolerant, you might say. So, being queer in Georgian Britain, let's get into the details. So we'll begin with I've put some frequently asked questions. So I've defined the term queer. So were there queer people in Georgian Britain? Yes, so much. There have been queer people in kind of every society and every culture, but Georgian Britain kind of really engaged with its gender and sexual identity in a really unique and colourful way. How do we know this? What evidence do we have? We actually have a lot of evidence. It's difficult to find. It takes a lot of work. It takes a kind of paid role, like myself, to go and investigate and spend time digging out these stories. But the stories are there. Some of the places that I found these stories are diaries of the time, court records, newspapers, artworks, letters, literature, biographies. The list goes on. But the point is, the stories are there. If queer people weren't called queer, what were they called? There's a whole number of terms they were called. I'm going to spend some time on some specific examples of this language, but you might see on the board, on the slides, I've included words like molly, sodomite, tribade, tommy, macaroni, and saphists. These are some, but there are many more. You might also be interested to recognise none of those words. Or actually, some of those words are closer to our current uses than we think. For example, you might not recognise the word Tommy, but I'm sure you've heard of a tomboy. So a Tommy, for the Georgians, was a female who acted with masculine behaviour. So actually, some of the words are much closer to our own semantics today, as you might think. The big question wasn't homosexual behaviour illegal? Technically, yes, but it was much more complex than that. And this is the kind of real point that I want to kind of start with. How was it complicated? Well, let's get into the detail. So what was technically illegal was the act of sodomy. Sodomy was kind of defined at the time by penetrative anal sex between two men, and actually also bestiality was counted as sodomy, as buggery. So this term was kind of actually used for both people who had sex with animals at the time and men who had sex with men. So as you can see, it's really kind of been associated with quite in a derogatory manner. If it was enforced, if the full kind of legal force of the law was applied to someone caught in sodomitical acts, then the punishment was death, and the punishment was death by hanging, typically. Flogging and pillorying were also used for other kind of instances of homosexual behavior, for example, oral sex. And pillorying is when a pillory is kind of that instrument at the time with a hole for a head and a hole for two arms, and you were kind of left in the public. People would throw things at you, spit at you, so kind of really humiliating public spectacles were made of this behavior. Blackmail was a huge risk. We're going to see later an example of letters, intimate love letters between two men, which were intercepted and used as extortion because the punishment was so severe. And entrapment with the threat of sodomy was really popular. Especially, you might be surprised to know, with highwaymen. Guns were expensive at the time. If you were a highwayman and you had a second person with you, you could stop a carriage and say, if you don't give me your money, if you don't give me your jewels, I will go to the courts and say that I saw you engaging in sodomy, and they'll hang you. So, you know, these things that we would never imagine today, but the threat of the kind of ultimate punishment of hanging was really used and extorted by some unpleasant people. And it's also important to note that there were certain groups, the Society for the Reformation of Manners, who made it their personal mission to, for example, eradicate homosexual behavior. I said this was a celebratory talk. And this is the kind of technical stuff. This is the facts. In reality, the situation was much, much more complex than this. This is what happened by fact, but in reality, the law was very vague and difficult to verify. So to enforce the death penalty, the maximum sentence for this behavior, there had to be proof of the act, as in kind of actually being kind of caught in the act, and there had to be at least 2 witnesses. So actually, that's very hard to prove. So firstly, we have that. Secondly, even when it could be proved, even when evidence was absolutely unambiguous, in many, many cases, we find that the law wasn't actually used to its full extent. So many, many times people were acquitted, even when there was unambiguous evidence. Many trials got lots of public attention, and many garnered a lot of public sympathy. A lot of them got royal sympathy. Some people got pardoned specifically by the king. So even though you could technically get prosecuted for this behavior, it wasn't often enforced. If you press me for numbers, no one can give numbers, but roughly less than 10% of people were actually kind of prosecuted fully, even if caught and even if the evidence was unambiguous. A huge factor, the law only applied to men. So this kind of very narrow view of what sodomy encountered meant that sex between women, well, quite frankly, it wasn't considered sex. So women engaging in sexual behavior between each other, that was fine as far as the law was concerned, because as far as the Georgians were concerned, they struggled to believe that sex between women could be possible. And we'll see kind of how that's kind of applied in real life in a second. So even though the facts of the matter is, yes, it was illegal, and yes, it did have the kind of ultimate implications if you were caught, only rarely was that ever actually enforced. Let me give you an example. We're here to hear real stories about real people. This example I love because I found it in a very obscure place, and it mentions certainly the earliest instance that I found of a person of colour engaging in queer behaviour. So this is a court-martial log from a ship called the Gladiator, and it's the court-martial log from 1811. This is in the National Archives in Kew, so you can go and see this the next time you go to London if you so wanted to. I spend my life digging through materials like this. I'm an expert at difficult Georgian handwriting. You can see at the very top there, the kind of, at the top of the page there is a kind of name underlined, and the name underlined is John Powell, a black man. And Charles Salmon, this note says, both belonging to the said ship, were discovered by William Brown the captain in a situation to leave no doubt in the captain's mind that they had committed the act of sodomy and another unnatural act. That's normally euphemistic Georgian language for oral sex. The court proceeded to try the said John Powell, and having heard the evidence forwarded in support of the charge and by the prisoner in their defence and what he had to allege in support thereof, and having maturely and deliberately weighed and considered the whole, the court is of opinion that the charge has not been sufficiently proved against the said John Powell, and doth therefore judge him to be acquitted, and the said John Powell is therefore acquitted accordingly. So this is a case which interests me because the most senior person on that ship unambiguously caught two men having sex with each other, tried to enforce the full extent of the law and was unable to. This was a group decision by a group of men. You can see their signatures on the right hand of the page. So this is a kind of jury decision, and a decision had to be unanimous. So that means that unanimously a group of men knew that these two men had had sex. Probably it was consensual, probably they'd expressed regret, probably they said, oh, we won't do it again. And so this charge, that no consequences, no further consequences came of this. Just an extra little tidbit, as I'm a Jane Austen scholar, one of the names of these group of men you might recognise. So this signature here, if you can see on the screen, is Francis William Austen. That is Jane Austen's brother. Jane Austen had two naval officer brothers. If you think Jane Austen didn't know about gay sex, she really did know about gay sex. Okay. Let's just go back to some of these terms. We're still in Georgian Britain generally, so we're still kind of operating on a kind of national level. And I just want to go through some of these terms in a bit more detail. So let's start with molly and sodomite, which were the kind of two most popular terms associated with queer behaviour at the time. So images of the time are really helpful. So on the right is a depiction of two people described as sodomites. This is from a print from 1702. This is a kind of pamphlet published by the Anglican Church, kind of decrying sodomitical behaviour. And on the left, we have a depiction of a man described as a molly. Actually, this is a depiction of a molly house. So a molly house and a molly, as we know, was a kind of term for a homosexual man at the time. This is an extract from the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue. It's one of my favourite documents of the Georgian era. It's what we would think of as Urban Dictionary. This kind of dictated kind of the slang terms in popular use at the time, and new editions were published as new terms came into vogue. You can see that it describes a moll as what the Georgians use the word a whore, and a molly, or a Miss Molly, as an effeminate fellow or a sodomite. So a molly was either a person who acted, a man who acted in an effeminate way, or a man who had sex with other men. So molly houses were coffee houses that catered specifically for men who were interested in other men. And often that term is associated with sex, with brothels. That's not quite true. Certainly sex happened in molly houses. I'm not denying that. But really, it was genuinely just a coffee house. You could go there for food, you could go there for drinks, you could go there to read the papers. It was basically almost like a prototype of a gay bar. That's the kind of nearest kind of thing we have. It's a kind of Georgian community safe space if you were a queer man at the time. As you can see, in this depiction of a molly house, the mother, because a molly house always had a mother, is wearing the man's hat and his sword, and yes, that is as phallic as it sounds. And the man is clutching her fan, which is a kind of feminine accessory, and he's wearing her headpiece. So this is engaging in cross-dressing behaviour. most famous Molly House was Mother Clapp's Molly House, which was raided in 1726. 40 people were caught. And again, just for numbers, 40 people caught in this kind of behaviour. 3 people were prosecuted and executed. So I by no means want to kind of trivialise or kind of make light of the fact that 3 people had this really tragic end. I just kind of use that. I think it's interesting in terms of ratio and numbers, that out of 40 people, only 3 people actually were treated in the way that the law dictated they should be. And I just put one other quote to do with so-called sodomites or mollies. This is an extract from Matthew Tomlinson, and I love this journal because it's by a Yorkshire labourer who's a kind of middle class, he's a labouring class man. And what's amazing about him is he writes this really detailed journal that's very introspective. And I love it because it gives you a kind of insight into how an ordinary person at the time thought. And he talks about so many things: food, water, hygiene, and he has this really interesting passage on men having sex with men, which I find really fascinating. Let me read it to you. "It must seem strange indeed that God Almighty should make a being with such a nature, or such a defect in nature, and at the same time make a decree that if that being who he had formed should at any time follow the dictates of that nature with which he was formed, he should be punished with death." You can really hear Matthew Tomlinson thinking, hang on, I'm being told this by the Anglican Church, but then also, does that make sense? So you can see how ordinary people are actually really thinking in quite what we would think of quite modern and forward-thinking ways about men who are having sex with men. Another term that we get a lot at the time is macaronis, and these weren't specifically men who had sex with men. This was a kind of term for a man who dressed in a very specific, hyper-fashionable way, and they're a real thing. They're all over the country, but they were satirised a lot for how effeminate they were and also their kind of fashion choices. I mean, I can see why you would be satirised for this kind of fashion choice. I wouldn't be seen dead. Some people say that these were just straight men who were just fashionable and we shouldn't kind of include them in the kind of remit of the queer community. Well, I put to those people prints like this one. This is a print from 1776. It's called The Cold Rump, or Taste a la Mode. This is a macaroni who is warming himself by the fire, but he's warming a very specific part of himself by the fire. So he's kind of holding up his coattails. He's warming what the language of the time is, of the print is his rump on the fire. And he's also kind of quite significantly surrounded by these kind of phallic-looking pokers as well. The joke here is that taste a la mode, or the kind of taste, the fashion at the time, is very specifically to do with interesting ways to warm your rump, you know? So specifically, macaronis were being associated with gay anal sex at the time. I'm just looking at time, and I'm going to skip over this specific example of a famous macaroni, but I might come back to him at the end if we're doing good for time. I want to get on to saphists and tribates. This was the term for females who engaged in intimate same-sex behaviour, and saphist is actually kind of directly related to the modern term lesbian. Sappho was a classical poet who was a woman who wrote about loving other women, and she lived on the Isle of Lesbos, and that's where we get the term lesbian from. The two terms are basically have the same root. These are just 2 examples of 2 high-profile female couples who were very close friends at the time. So on the right, you can see a print called Love a la Mode. Again, it's using exactly the same terminology as that print that I showed you, Taste a la Mode. So the kind of love that's fashionable in the Georgian era is 2 dear friends. That's the kind of subtitle of the print. And it shows Lady Strachan and Lady Warwick. They're possibly sharing a secret, but probably doing something else with their lips. And you can see their husbands in the bushes behind them. And apologies for the kind of quality of the speech bubble, but the speech bubble in the middle says, "Little does he know that his rival is a female." So it's making quite a clear statement, a kind of wink-wink statement about what the real meaning behind being 2 dear friends actually means. On the left, we have another very kind of high-profile, really cute story. They're called The Ladies of Llangollen. So on the right, we have Eleanor Ponsonby. On the left, we have Eleanor Butler, and on the left, we have Sarah Ponsonby. These two women were born in upper-class Irish families, and they eloped to be with each other. They kind of set up house with each other. They created a home for each other in rural Wales and kind of just lived a very quiet, happy life by themselves, kind of unbothered by the rest of the world. And just to get a flavour of the kind of life they led each other, I have an extract from Eleanor Butler's diary, and this is just how she describes a typical day. It rained without interruption the entire day. From 4 until 10, I read to my Sally. She was drawing. And then from 10 until 11, I sat over the fire conversing with my beloved. It was a silent, happy day. We can say that's too, dear friends, but it's hard to look at language like that, my beloved, and that really kind of possessive, cute, my Sally, no one else's Sally, my Sally. It's hard to read language like that and not, with our modern perspective, interpret that as being anything other than kind of just strictly platonic relationship. This was a very intimate, emotive relationship. And at the time, they kind of rejected the insinuation that their relationship might be sexual. People were obsessed with asking them if their relationship was sexual. They didn't want the attention to be on that, and they just wanted the focus to be on themselves, their quiet, peaceful life. This is a talk about Georgian Bath, so let's get to Bath. What I think is really amazing about the scene in Bath is that everyone is interested in queer Georgians at the moment. It's very kind of a la mode, historical topic. There is a book coming out in September called Queer Georgians. It's by Antti Delaney. It will be amazing, so do get that book if it comes out. But what's really interesting is the focus is very London-centric. And London as a queer space, especially in the Georgian era, it makes sense. It was by far the biggest city in Europe. Actually, it was the second biggest city, most historians agree, in the world at that point. There was only one other city in Japan that was bigger than London. So if you have a city that big, so unusually big, just statistically speaking, there must be a lot of queer people in that population. But also, crucially, London offered this really unique opportunity for anonymity in a way that not many other spaces in the world could. And so that's why there's such a kind of queer subculture associated with Georgian London. What I love about Georgian Bath is it really shows you that point I was making at the beginning about the way that Bath saw the world differently to the way that anywhere else in the country did. And just the social rules in Bath just worked very differently. For example, if you were a kind of MP of a Whig and an MP of a Tory in the Georgian era, in London you weren't allowed to talk to each other. It was kind of very heavily policed who you were to be seen with and who you weren't to be seen with. You could be seen with anyone in Bath. They could be in the same concert, same ball, same card event. They could talk to each other. So the rules work differently in Bath. And for 4 people in particular, I'm going to use as examples of the kind of ways that people interacted with Bath as queer people. These are the 4 big names that I'm going to talk about tonight. 4 points to you if you know who they are, just from their portraits. They are the Chevalier d'Eon, top left, William Beckford on the top right, bottom right, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and on the left, Anne Lister. So those are the 4 people I'm going to talk about in the most detail, but I'm going to finish with just a nod to all the people who lived in Georgian Bath who weren't one of the richest people in the country or weren't one of the most influential women in the country, who we know very little about, who they just went about their day-to-day business, who it's very difficult to find historical documentary information about, but who I think deserve a mention. So these are the 5 areas that I want to cover in the remainder of my time. I'm going to start with the Chevalier d'Eon, who is one of my absolute favourite figures in the 18th century. Just out of interest, can I get a show of hands in the room who's heard of the Chevalier d'Eon before? That's really interesting. It's about half, I'd say 50-50. The Chevalier d'Eon is becoming very trendy at the moment because they're now becoming associated as a possible contender for a very early example of a trans person in Georgian Britain. The Chevalier was assigned male at birth in France in 1728. They spent the first 49 years of their life living as a man, but they spent the second part of their life living as a woman. Had the most interesting and amazing life. So born in France, as I said, began as a kind of soldier, a very successful military career, changed into a kind of diplomat role, started coming to England on diplomatic missions, and then actually kind of employed by the French court as a spy. So a kind of spy, a French spy living in England, kind of passing back information to France. But there was one thing wrong, and or at least one thing wrong to the kind of French court's eyes, and that was the issue of the Chevalier's gender. The Chevalier really encouraged discussion, talk, speculation about what gender they were, and they insisted that they were female. And actually, the amazing thing about the Chevalier is they successfully petitioned the French court to recognize them as a woman. This is literally by Louis XVI. So the king officially recognizes that from then on, the Chevalier should no longer be recognized as a man. From then on, they'll be recognized as a woman. You might notice that I'm being very careful with my pronoun choices. I'm using gender-neutral pronouns. And this is a really tricky area of conversation, actually. As a historian, if this is a straight-up example of trans identity, someone who's assigned male at birth but identifies as a female, really, we should be using female pronouns. We should be kind of respecting the choices of the person who's most qualified to make that call. But this is the 18th century, and it's hard to say if there is ever a kind of example of a straight-up example of trans identity, even nowadays, let alone kind of then. So, and also the kind of complicated factor about the Chevalier d'Eon is that gender was such a hot topic at the time, and the status of them being either a man or a woman really meant things in terms of political power. For example, their rights to inherit, their rights to operate as an employee of the French court. So actually the French court had specific conditions about if they were to continue receiving their stipend, they had to dress in a particular way, they had to act in a particular way. And so it's not quite as simple as just saying the Chevalier wore a dress because they identified as a woman. It's quite possible to be a man and like to wear a dress. So that's why pronoun choice is so difficult with the Chevalier. We can't go back in time and ask them. For now, I'm going to use gender-neutral pronouns. You're going to ask me, this sounds really interesting, what does the Chevalier have to do with Bath? A French spy in Bath? Well, the Chevalier d'Eon kind of surrendered the kind of privilege of this income and kind of chose England as their new home with this new female identity. Very, very popular with the British public, who also kind of respected the fact that they identified as a woman. And what was really spectacular about the Chevalier d'Eon is the kind of self-marketing that they did. They put on amazing, spectacular shows where they kind of used this kind of amazing skill of swordsmanship that they developed in this military career to have stupendously kind of displays where they would kind of invite kind of really talented swordsmen and fencing masters and run rings around them in kind of full female dress. And this was a kind of spectacle, but the Georgians loved it, and the Chevalier loved it, loved the attention, and specifically loved the money. So toured around the country kind of doing these one-off displays, these kind of fencing displays. This is one kind of depiction of a fencing display. Would go to a city, kind of arrive at the weekend, do a show, get the money, go to the next city, do another show, until they arrive at Bath. In 1796. They do not do a show in Bath, they kind of do a show. It's so well received that they do a second show, and then a third show, a fourth show, a fifth show. The people of Georgian Bath love the Chevalier. And so it's one of the only places we see this kind of rapid, quick-fire tour of the country pause. There is something unique about Bath which makes the Chevalier stop and feel safe enough to stay. They actually lived here for 3 months. And that's kind of very unusual. It tells you something about the atmosphere, the climate of Bath, which felt like a safe place for them to stop. At first, they exhibited in exhibition rooms, in studios, in the fencing school, all very small spaces. They developed enough of an audience to move to the lower rooms, so a kind of maybe a room kind of not much bigger than this, but was so popular that they sold out the assembly rooms, the Bath assembly rooms. If you've been in the ballroom, in the Bath assembly rooms, you know it's big. You can fit thousands. So that tells you just how loved and cherished the Chevalier was in Bath. The kind of population of Bath was so uniquely welcoming and inclusive that this was a space where they could sell out a room that could fill thousands. Who else do I think is important to Georgian Bath? I can't talk about queer people in Georgian Bath without talking about William Beckford. You might recognise Beckford by the tower, which is just above Bath. So you can see this has this beautiful panoramic view of the city and the kind of surrounding countryside. I really encourage you to go and visit. You might know him from being the author of a very popular Gothic novel at the time. Or you might know him from his most controversial relationship. And that was with a young man called William Courtenay. And when Beckford was 24 years old, he was a kind of rising star on the political scene. He was brought up in immense privilege. Actually, historians think he was the richest heir in the country at the time. That money came directly from Jamaican sugar plantations manned by enslaved Africans. So this tower that you can see on the screen is beautiful, but it's also impossible to visit that tower without thinking of the human cost that went into making it. Beckford was the kind of recipient of the wealth of these plantations, and he kind of his career, I guess, was interrupted when he was 24, when intimate love letters were leaked between him and William Courtenay. This was extremely controversial, both then and now, because at the time that those letters were leaked, William Courtenay was 16 years old. And those letters suggested evidence that this relationship had been going on for at least a few years. That means, in modern terms, in the present day, we would consider that the relationship between an adult and a minor. The Georgians obviously saw things slightly differently, but this was still extremely scandalous. In the context of a society in which child marriage was still very common, and when I say common, I mean it was a kind of widespread practice, especially for economic reasons. Girls could get married at the age of 12 with parental consent. For boys, it was 14 years old. It helps to contextualize this relationship, but it doesn't make it any less problematic, especially when you remember that William Beckford was the richest heir in the country. If you think about the implications of the power dynamics, the relationship dynamics in that relationship. So this is a really difficult relationship, but one thing for sure, we find it complex, the Georgians found it complex. This absolutely changed William Beckford's life. He almost immediately fled the country. He spent time on the continent for a very long time. Eventually, he felt safe enough to come back to the UK. He kind of hid in the countryside in huge, enormous country houses, and eventually wanted to rejoin society in a way that he could, to the extent that he could, to the extent that it might be safe for him. What town, what city did he choose? He chose Bath. Again, that tells you something about the social scene in Bath. It tells you that there was some level of forgiveness or tolerance available in Bath that might not necessarily exist in other spaces. So William Beckford has a very complicated story, and there are aspects that we might find really troubling. My takeaway from Beckford is it's okay to feel conflicted about a figure like Beckford. It's okay to find one of his relationships really complicated, but also it's okay to kind of feel how tragic that one thing kind of defined him for the rest of his life, that he never felt safe again, kind of lived in perpetual exile after this. One of my other favourite people in the Georgian era, definitely my favourite female of the period, is Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. She is an amazing figure, and the more I learn about Georgiana, the more I love her. Georgiana has quite a tragic story in many ways, and it's the story of a woman who was intelligent and charismatic and charming and political and clever, and surrounded by men who were very much less so, and who really was kind of punished for those features, but also had really interesting character flaws, and kind of made some big mistakes in life. So she's just such an interesting figure. Georgiana spent a lot of time in Bath. She was married to the Duke of Devonshire at a very young age. She quickly became one of the most important people in the country. She was intensely political. She was at the centre of Whig society. If you wanted to influence, if you wanted to rise in the Georgian world, you had to be in Georgiana's close circle. She had a lot of influential social power. But the reason I'm talking about her in a talk on queer Georgians is that she had a really fascinating triangular relationship with this lady, Lady Elizabeth Foster. We'll call her Bess. So these three, Bess was Georgiana's best friend. They lived in a triangular relationship. We would now probably recognise this, probably associate it with language like polyamory, so kind of two people or three people living in a throuple. And the dynamics of this relationship are really complex, they're difficult to fathom. It was very forward-thinking at the time. It was a very kind of openly known secret. They lived together, kind of people visited them all the time. Georgiana was one of the most popular people in the country. Everyone knew about her life. Everyone knew about this interesting triangular relationship. So part of my job as Inclusive Histories curator is to kind of untangle some of this nuance. I had a really inconvenient part of my job where I had to go to Chatsworth and had to go to the archives to look through the letters to see what they did in Bath as a kind of a triangle, as a threesome. One thing that all the historians agree with is that Bath was a really key point in this triangular relationship. It was where they met Bess, it was where Georgiana met Bess to begin with, but it was also where a lot of the kind of most interesting dynamics of their relationship happened. Bath had this atmosphere which could facilitate and tolerate this really non-conforming kind of relationship. They agree, Bess and Georgiana and the Duke agree, they call Bath the most scandalous place in England, a place that could tolerate scandal. Georgiana went to balls at the Assembly Rooms, which makes me very happy. She went in riding habits. Just for your info, a riding habit looks like this. At the time, Georgian women went to balls in very big dresses, but the focus was on feminine accessories. When I say that, I mean huge hair pieces, I mean flowers, fruit, ornamentation, ribbons, trim, anything you could do to make your kind of accessorize yourself and make yourself more feminine was better. The more, the better. And then Georgiana goes to balls wearing this, the kind of most masculine thing that you could at the time. There are no accessories. She's wearing almost what looks like as a man's shirt with man's sleeves, man's cuffs, man's kind of ruffles at the top. This is how Georgiana goes to balls. And because she's so popular, people copy this. She was the one who kind of popularized the big hair and the big hats. She was the one who's kind of popularizing this really gender-bending, cross-dressing, non-conforming behavior. What was her relationship with Bess? Was it best friends? Was it two dear friends? Or was it something more? I'll leave you to judge, but this is some of the things that she says to Bess when they're away. My dear Bess, do you hear the voice of my heart crying to you? Do you feel what it is for me to be separated from you? This was a really complex relationship, and even I, kind of looking through the letters, find it hard to untangle exactly what was going on. There were hot, there were cold, there were kind of moments where everything was going very well, there were moments when it was complex. But what we can say, this was a very non-conforming relationship. I would consider this a very queer relationship, and a lot of it happened in Bath. It's in the talk. It's going in for the remit. Okay, the last kind of big figure I want to mention, I'm just going to wrap up quickly now, is Anne Lister. We know that she visited Bath in, what's the year? The year's gone out of my head now. I think it's 1826. 1824, actually, just kind of came to me. She visits and she lives in 10 Rivers Street. We know about what she gets up to because she mentions it in her diary. Anne Lister is kind of being popularised recently in the TV series Gentleman Jack. She's kind of basically kind of seen as one of the first modern lesbians. And the reason why that term is applied to her, even though she's such a Georgian figure, is because she solemnised her relationship with Anne Walker by a kind of religious ceremony, that was very, very much associated with marriage. They took sacrament together and committed themselves to each other. Basically, two women committing them to each other in a church, in a legal, not illegal, but a kind of religious ceremony. It looks very much like marriage. And she loved Bath. She loved the fact that, for example, women could dance with each other here. Remember that the country was almost perpetual war in the Georgian era. The men were off fighting. There are lots of women in Bath. What do they do at the balls? They dance together. That's a very kind of queer-adjacent kind of behaviour. Anne Lister would have loved that. I know for certain that she visits the assembly rooms. I found that out very recently, literally last week. I was very, very happy to find that. She goes to a concert. She has a mixed time. She likes it. She says the crowd was great, great crowd. The band very good. The singing tolerable. And very busy. Got home by 10:15. I'm going to wrap up by just finishing on just some tiny snippets from Georgian newspapers from Bath at the time. I can't share with you any more details about these people than what I can find in the papers, and often that's just a sentence. But here are 5 instances of other people who are engaging in queer or queer-adjacent behaviour in Georgian Bath. This was a servant. John Bunnings, a gentleman's servant, was brought up at our quarter sessions yesterday on a charge of assault with an intention to commit an unnatural crime on a lad. He was remanded to prison for want of bail. That's really interesting because what we know from that is that he wasn't prosecuted fully, he was let go on bail. So he was kind of almost partially acquitted, only this is a servant. This is not a William Beckford. He doesn't have the money to kind of to deliver bail. So actually he does go to prison. But that's to do with his kind of social status, his class, his economic availability, as opposed to what he did. Monday at this assizes at Bridgewater, Aaron Bywater, a brewer of Walcott, some of you may live in Walcott, was convicted of an attempt to commit an unnatural crime on Joseph Beaver. That's from 1781. This is an example of that kind of extortion example that I gave at the very beginning of the talk. So apologies if you can't see this from the back. Again, Georgian newspapers, not great for high-res images and image quality. But this is a really interesting example. Matthias Driscoll extorted money under a threat of prosecution for an unnatural crime. So that's nothing to do with queer behaviour, but this is one of those people who tries to extort money to blackmail another person by threatening them to give evidence that they were committing sodomy. What happened to him? He was executed. People took that really seriously. This is another example of someone who was John Gideon. So halfway through the extract is charged with assaulting James Stannard with intent to commit an unnatural crime, was convicted of the assault only, sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment. It's almost as if the fact that there was an unnatural crime bit, the fact that there was something gay about it was just erased from the record. Actually, that's not the bit that people care about. It's the fact that this was seemed to be non-consensual. So consent is the issue here. It's not the actual kind of act. And finally, another example from 1802, someone who was convicted of an attempt to commit an unnatural crime, sentenced to 12 months. This was probably quite a bad case because this person was definitely sentenced to a year in prison, but the last 3 months in solitary confinement. So there are some really sad stories here, but on the whole, I think I've proved that Bath had the capacity to kind of think about these things in a quite what we would think of as a forward-thinking way. So to sum up, were there queer Georgians? I hope you can take away that there absolutely were. They found ways to negotiate the legal system. And I want to emphasize again that it was the act of sodomy that was criminalized. You could go up to anyone and say, I'm gay, I'm a homosexual, And that was not illegal. And some people did, especially if they were rich. They could get away with that. The thing that not to be caught at was being in the act and make sure there weren't two witnesses. There were queer people in Georgian Bath, very thriving queer subculture here that's uniquely diverse, uniquely inclusive, tolerant social scene. So was it a queer-friendly place? Arguably nowhere in Georgian Britain was queer-friendly. But if one place was, I think you could argue a good contender would be Georgian Bath. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Tim is kindly offering to take questions now. People on the online can put their questions in the chat channel, and Hazel here will take a microphone around. Could you please hold the mic up and speak into it, because otherwise the Zoom audience won't be able to hear the question.
So, great presentation. Thank you, Tim. Wasn't Bo Nash bisexual, and what role would he have played in setting the queer scene in Bath?
That is a great question. Bo Nash gets a lot of attention because obviously he had such a huge influence on Bath in general and the social scene. Bo Nash was a really complicated figure, and the evidence is I think Bo Nash was a very friendly figure, is what I will put on record. I haven't done a lot of research myself into Bo Nash, partly because Bo Nash partly kind of predates the Assembly Rooms opening, actually. So my kind of knowledge on Bo Nash isn't the strongest, but certainly he had a huge influence on the social dynamics of Bath. He was the one who kind of really introduced this kind of notion of inclusivity. He was the one who said, people of Bath shouldn't be alone kind of privately at their own little private dinner parties or private routes. They should be mixing with each other. They should be actually mixing with different kinds of people than themselves. So absolutely, I definitely think that Bo Nash had a huge influence on Bath's social scene, even if I can't comment very much on the kind of question, the debate about whether he was bisexual or not.
Can I go back to the comments you made about female friendships?
Yes.
I seem to remember that there was something, I don't know, related to Jane Austen or letters or whatever, where it seems to imply sometimes almost like it was encouraged, these female friendships, which, I mean, again, I'm sort of like a little bit, was it encouraged so they had someone to talk to? Was it, because you were talking about like, there wasn't probably the sense that females would have sex or would have ability to pleasure each other or something. I'm just like curious where this came from, this like kind of encouragement, versus, yeah, because obviously the other thing was, oh, just lay back and think of the empire or something, right? There was this, like, I'm just like really curious about like female sexuality and how that was viewed, if at all, and if you found anything.
Thank you. It's such a good question. It's really tricky at the time because women and kind of relationship, and especially in marriage, was so often a kind of economic decision. If a woman kind of didn't have a male dependent, she had to think about how to eat, kind of as a spinster, kind of where to get, how to kind of keep eating, how to keep a roof over her head, which meant that kind of women seeking kind of companionate relationships was not often or always a focus. And it means that there are a lot of relationships where there are marriages that are entered in for economic reasons, where the couple kind of embark on other relationships to find companionship. And this is often where these kind of close female companions come in for women. So yes, it was encouraged. It was a kind of a way to, the Georgians thought in some ways very progressively, but some ways very reductively about women. It was a way to kind of maintain kind of feminine sanity, to kind of have a reliable companion. It was almost implied that it would keep women in order if they had kind of other kind of people around them who kind of thought in the right way. So these female companionships were very difficult, but partly kind of related to economic. It's not, it's kind of a partial answer. That's kind of as much as I can say. I say the Georgians, I kind of flippantly said they kind of didn't think it was possible for women to have sex. That was kind of the majority view. It wasn't the universal view. And there is, for example, a kind of very thriving kind of pornographic literature trade at the time. The most popular is called Fanny Hill, the Memoirs of Fanny Hill. It's published in 1749, very, very popular, kind of published all the way throughout the 19th century as well. And that has kind of very graphic descriptions of same-sex behavior in a kind of way that leaves you no doubt that the Georgians, some Georgians at least, did understand that other kind of alternate types of sex were possible. So I hope that in some way answers your question. Thank you. Great.
You touched a bit on the fact that Bath itself was a very inclusive place compared with other locations. Why Bath? Was it the people that drove it? Was it the wealth in the area? Why Bath versus another town or city in the UK?
Ah, that's my husband, and he's asking very hard questions. Not coming to my next talks. What a great question. It's it's really fascinating. I think some of the fact that it's a very small place. So, for example, you can't avoid people when you're in Bath. So even if you kind of think very differently to each other, if, for example, that example of kind of people being Whigs or Tories, London is a big space, and there's kind of very kind of separately made spaces for Whig circles, for Tory circles. Georgiana's circle was the Whig circle. So in Bath, there just isn't room for that. There is one venue that's the most fashionable in the country. Obviously, there's two sets of assembly rooms, but Bath assembly rooms, the upper assembly rooms, the new rooms, that was the place to be. And it was one place. You kind of, if you wanted to go to the balls, you had to all go to the same venue. Partly it was to do with specifically Beau Nash, who had this really progressive view, as this gentleman raised. So lots of kind of interlinking factors, but the fact that it was such a small place with the kind of highest echelons of society is one reason, at least, that I can think of off the top of my head. But definitely a PhD in there, I think, somewhere. Great, so more questions? Hello.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Do you think that Bath would have had one or maybe more Molly coffee houses in Georgian?
That is a great question. I've been searching for that for nearly 3 years. What I can tell you is Bath had a very thriving trade of sex workers, and we have evidence of over 80 named people who were tried for being sex workers in the city in the Georgian period. That's a lot for a small city. None of them were men, so I found no kind of evidence of male sex workers, and I found no specific evidence of a Molly house in Bath yet. That might be one kind of theory for that is because actually it was one of the only places in the country where you didn't need a Molly house. Actually, you could go into a regular coffee house because Bath was such a radical place, and actually there wasn't the same kinds of stigma that existed elsewhere. But the short answer is no, I haven't found a Bath Molly house yet. I would love to. I suspect that I would have found by now if there was one, but watch this space.
I've got a few questions in the chat channel. Yes. The first one is basically the same question about Molly houses in Georgian Bath, which you've just answered.
Great, thank you.
Then the next question from Siobhan is, how did the Molly houses become popular amongst the queer community at a time when being seen was legally risky? Was it just through word of mouth from wealthier people?
That's a really interesting question. I think that it would have been a word of mouth thing. It was they weren't specifically class specific spaces. Kind of coffee houses existed both in adjacency to and kind of either side of the spectrum of taverns. So some of them were quite wealthy spaces, but some of them were very inclusive, what you'd call kind of working class spaces. So it wasn't just wealthy people, it would have been kind of passed around word of mouth. I think if there was a Molly house in Bath for this reason, it would have been impossible not to have missed it. Yeah, and the point about being seen, I think that's why they were so popular in a kind of era where actually, even if it wasn't enforced, the threat of blackmail and the threat of real kind of serious implications of punishment did exist. That was why these spaces did exist and why they were so popular. It was so important for there to be a safe space to kind of, in response to the brutality, the possible brutality of the law. So I hope that answers some of the question.
And Lucy Andrew asks, have you identified any potential queer representation in Jane Austen's work, and particularly in her novels set in Bath?
Well, the answer to that is yes, luckily. There is one reference in the whole of Jane Austen's works to the activities that men get up to in the Navy. It's a very interesting reference. It happens in Mansfield Park. So it's not in terms of a kind of specific Bath reference, but it does kind of use a joke about kind of titles in the Navy. You get, for example, vice admirals, you get rear admirals, and Jane Austen makes a very dirty joke about rears and vices, i.e. like the kind of naughty behaviour you get up to with your rear. And there are some Jane Austen scholars, some more conservative Jane Austen scholars, who look at that and they say, well, she can't possibly have meant. You can deduct whether you think I agree with them. I think I saw a question here. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is, what advice or tips would you give to somebody wanting to do their own research into queer histories?
Thank you so much. Terminology is really important. So kind of getting to know the terminology at the time. I looked, for example, through the Georgian newspapers for terms like Sapphist or Sapphism and Tribadism. Almost no mentions, because this was a kind of concept that the Georgians, even though the language existed, it wasn't something that they kind of codified or put into newspapers very easily. Whereas as soon as you put in the phrase unnatural crime, you kind of saw there like 5 instances popped up, all within Bath, all within kind of 20 or 30 years. And there are much more kind of things like that go on. We only know evidence of the people that got caught, really. Most people are just getting on with it and no one will know about it. You couldn't put it on paper because then obviously you'd be blackmailed. So really, it was all going on behind closed doors, but understanding the terminology, I think, really helped me kind of first really start getting results when I was looking for this. I should also say at the Bath Assembly Rooms, we had like a team of research volunteers who helped me research a lot of these topics. They do amazing work. Some of them are in the room today, actually. So if you're interested in kind of doing some of this research in association with the Assembly Rooms, please do send us a message and get in touch. We're always interested in people joining the team.
Hello. You haven't mentioned the theatre and what influence dressing up when Shakespeare's time and so on had on people and what they, like to do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really great point. So the theatre was obviously such a political space at the time. This isn't in the time of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's kind of plays are so implicitly and inherently queer because they automatically involve any female character is played by a man. And then Shakespeare loves cross-dressing, loves kind of thinking about gender bending. So often you get, for example, real men who are playing characters who are women but dressed up as a man, and so you kind of get this kind of implicit kind of queer, atmosphere in Shakespearean plays. Shakespearean plays were very popular at the Bath Theatre Royal through the Georgian era, and it's kind of the predecessor of what we would now think of as the Royale. Were there any kind of queer plays? Not really. There were a kind of few. Obviously, we had to have Marlowe's play, and so that was staged. But because women were kind of popular on the stage, there wasn't the same kind of implicitly kind of queer dynamics that we get on the Shakespearean stage. The theatre was a very popular venue in Bath, often very radical. Abolitionist plays were huge in Bath, a kind of very abolitionist-friendly city at the time. So Radical theatre in Bath, certainly. Queer theatre in Bath, much more difficult to evidence, but yes, there would have been, I'm sure there would have been queer behaviour in the theatre, yeah. Thank you.
Really good talk.
Thank you.
I'm interested to know to what extent you, or if you factor in queer platonic relationships, especially in cases like the Ladies of Llangollen, and sort of generally female queer relationships of the time with the perceived lack of female sexuality and so on. Is that not really blurry? Yeah.
So blurry, couldn't possibly be more blurry. So really impossible to read into this. It could be that the Ladies of Llangollen were two close friends, and frankly, with the kind of some of the gender dynamics at the time, if I was a woman, I can completely see why you'd want to just live in a cottage with another woman and kind of take yourself away from the male society at the time. So a lot of this stuff it is kind of using interpretative license or kind of using deduction with as much evidence as we can gain. The fact that people, for example, Anne Lister was obsessed with whether the Ladies of Llangollen had a sexual relationship. She visited them, she got her friends to visit them, she got Anne Walker to ask them specifically, so I guess my clearest answer to that question is so murky, but they found it murky too. They were interested in asking exactly the same questions we are. So great question, Anne Lister was asking the same. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. Born and bred in Istanbul. Personally, I'm interested in reading and understanding the history of Ottoman Empire. And corresponding the dates, for instance, back in the 15th and the 16th century, most of the activities and the history of the queer life would emerge in the bath themselves, in the Turkish saunas and hammams. And the city itself being associated with bath, Roman baths. So did it have any association with the emergence of the characters, of the history itself, or of the queer life in general in Bath?
Yes.
Do you place this anywhere in the history of the emergence of the concept?
What a fabulous question. I specialise in British history and a bit of French because of the adjacency of the French Revolution. But there are a few other places in the world that have really interesting things going on in their culture to do with queer studies in the 18th century. One of them is China, one of them is India, and one of them is the Ottoman Empire. So very adjacent. Though obviously kind of very different to the Georgian scene. Your question about baths is a brilliant one. Bath was, one of the reasons it was popular was because of its baths. And the baths were definitely, yes, seen to be a sexual place. They were a kind of innocent place, everyone would go. But the point was, in a society of quite strict at times gender segregation, everyone would go to the baths together. So the kind of notion of mixed bathing in kind of states of you would go clothed to the baths, you would wear kind of specific bathing robes, but they were very thin material. They were usually white, and what happens to thin white material when you get it wet? Yes. So yeah, there were lots of jokes made about how sexual the energy at the baths were. It wouldn't be too far to compare them to a kind of sauna or a bathhouse, or the things that were going on perhaps in Ottoman hammams. So I think that's a really nice link to make. Thank you so much. Last question here, this gentleman. Thank you.
Thanks. That was riveting. I should also say thanks to the National Trust for persevering with this sort of stuff, proving that history can be a bit more interesting than often portrayed. So what happened to queer Georgian Bath? It feels that Bath retreated into social conservatism after that. So what went wrong, as it were?
That is an excellent question. Well, the answer I'm going to give to that is not specific to Bath. It's a kind of general trend that happened around the country. The Georgians were a very liberal bunch. The Georgians actually, in many ways, think a lot like we do today. They think in some ways in very radical, forward-thinking ways. You could not really say that potentially about the Victorians who precede them. They have kind of much more kind of strictly codified ways of thinking about the world. They're much more religiously dogmatic. In terms of Christianity in particular, the Georgians were quite ambivalent. Anglicanism was, everyone was kind of nominally Anglican at the time, but there wasn't anything like the religious fervour that you associate with the Victorians. And so society as a whole just got a lot more conservative as the 19th century progressed. And one of the things that you can see that happening in Bath in particular, I told you that the Assembly Room started out as this really radically inclusive space in terms of social dynamics. Servants, hairdressers, shopkeepers in the same room as royals. Did that last? No, that was one of the first things to go. So I'm not standing here and telling you that there wasn't discrimination in Bath. Bath could still be a very discriminatory place. And the further you get into the 19th century, the more evidence of that discrimination, that kind of class snobbery, and many other kinds of snobbery, religious snobbery you get. So actually, by the year 1816, which is kind of some time into the kind of journey of the Assembly Rooms, that's the time that actually the kind of committee at the Assembly Rooms turn around and say, from now on, no more working class people can come to the balls. So yes, the climate of Georgian Bath did change. It did become more conservative, but that was kind of a trend that was universal to the country. The Victorians were just a much more morally dogmatic bunch than the Georgians. Some of the things I read and hear in the Georgian newspapers, you could hear in The Guardian today, whereas I can't think of almost anything I've ever read in a Victorian newspaper that I could say that of. So Giraffe, thank you so much for coming to this talk. I just want to say it's Pride Month, so happy Pride Month. This means a lot that you've come to kind of celebrate and show allyship and interest in topics like this. We're kind of doing this kind of research for the next few years, and we have specific funding for people like me to be interested in this research and to share it. So please do fill in that sheet if you can under your seats. The QR code is here for a survey, just to understand what kind of underrepresented histories you might be interested in hearing about, whether that's kind of working class people, people with disabilities, any aspect of Georgian Bath you'd love to hear more about, you'd love to send me into the archives to get evidence for, do let me know. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.